We're in project time management, and let's continue the discussion of developing the schedule. Develop schedule is part of project planning, and I'm assuming that we have already got a schedule network. We've already defined our activities from the bottom of the work breakdown structure. We thought about activity durations, we've thought about dependencies, we've built a critical path network. Here we have that network calculated either by ourselves or by our project management software. Notice that we have the early start, the early finish, the late start, the late finish dates, and if you take the difference between the early and the late, you get the total float, which is in the upper right-hand corner here. We've indicated the critical path, and I'm assuming that all of this is in place, but now we're going to be continuing to work on the schedule to make it a better modeling tool of the future of our project. So we have to make decisions about calendar. Now, the default would usually be that we're assuming it's a 5-day week and an 8-hour day. And that would be for the whole project. In fact, you can have one calendar for the whole project. You can adjust it different than what I just described. Or you can have different calendars for different resources that you would have on those activity. Now, speaking of resources, you can load resources onto your schedule activities, and resources can either be storable resources like supplies and other consumables, or resources can be non-storable resources, or known as work resources, and this would be people. It could just be people, or it could be people by job title, or it could be people by individual names. Or it could be equipment or facilities that could be in short supply. And we can load resources onto each activity. When you do load resources onto an activity, it could be linear like this. This is what I'm going to be assuming in the rest of this video clip. For example, you have 2 carpenters working steadily on this activity from beginning to end. You can load your resources differently. For example, you could have 400 labor hours of carpentry work, and you can have it distributed like this from beginning to end. I'll be assuming that it is linear. Now, once you've loaded resources onto your schedule bars, you can look at your resource histogram and find out how many carpenters do you need each day or week from now to the end of the project, given the schedule dates, the early schedule dates that were on our network diagram earlier. And you may find that the schedule, as you have developed it so far, requires more carpenters than you have, or has impractical peaks and valleys of carpenter use, and you may want to do resource leveling. So you can do resource smoothing within resource leveling. Here in resource smoothing, you're delaying some of the activities within their float. So if you take some activities that require carpenters and you delay them within their float, you may find that you can smooth out the peaks and valleys of carpenter usage. And you may find that to be good news. Resource smoothing, though, says that because you're just using up float, total float, you are not delaying the end date of the project. Maybe that's not good enough for you. Maybe your carpenter requirements are still more than you have available, and you need to lower the carpenter requirements even more down to, say, 12 carpenters. Well, if necessary, then you may have to delay some activities beyond their float and therefore delay the project completion. Bringing your resources right down to that number, say 12, is resource leveling. That's not actually the best label, resource, because it doesn't usually perfectly level your resources. It limits your resources. So really the result is a resource limited schedule. Now, I'm describing resource leveling as it's done in the algorithms in your project management software. Of course, in real life, you can use common sense and do other things to get your carpenter usage down. You could stretch out the duration of a task, or you could decide to get something done by other trades other than carpenters, or get the work done by carpenters at some supplier's shop and shipped in on a pallet so that you don't have to provide the carpenters. Or If you don't want to delay the end date and you don't want to do these other things that I've just described, maybe you have to increase the resources. But the good news is that you have a schedule, a resource-limited schedule now, that even if it's longer than it was before, it's more realistic because it's recognizing what you have in the way of resources. Now, you can do resource leveling yourself within the software, or you can use the algorithms within the software. Now, senior project planners of my acquaintance suggest that they use the resource leveling algorithms to test what the possibilities are, to play around with the network. But then when they actually comes to doing resource leveling, they will do it themselves, so they're in control of the actual steps that they're taking to do the resource leveling. You can do it with multiple projects. You can have your project files rolled up so that you're leveling carpenters on all 6 projects that are going on at once. Now, once you've done resource leveling and you have the resource limited schedule, float may not be meaningful, because even if an activity appears to have 2 weeks of float, if it requires carpenters, maybe you can't delay it, and maybe that may disrupt the carpenter usage on other activities. Hence, in the project management software, typically after you do resource leveling, the software shows all the activities as actually being critical. So float doesn't have as much meaning. Another thing that you do in in developing the schedule, more work at developing the schedule, is thinking about schedule risk. Let's assume that the tasks in your schedule have tight durations. They aren't padded for comfort. So the question is, where can you fit in some contingency reserve in your schedule? In other words, where can you put in a little bit of extra time? Because some things will go wrong. Some things will take a lot longer, some things will take a little bit less, and some surprises will happen. You will need more time than in a tight schedule. Where do you put that contingency reserve? So you can have a labeled activity that says contingency and put it at the end of the schedule. Or you can have it as float at the end of the schedule. You can pad it in your activity durations. I don't like that, because then instead of giving a work package leader 7 days, which is your tight duration, if you pad it to 9 days, it means that you're giving them 9 days to carry out the work. They're going to take 9 days. So you don't want to give away your contingency, or you can hide it in a few late activities, or have a phantom activity in the schedule. In other words, one that looks good but really isn't required. It's just there to give you extra time. I don't like that so much, because when people discover it, then I'm going to have a reputation of hiding my contingency, and people will always say in the future, don't worry, Ferndale's always got some contingency hidden in his schedule. You can have it as, what I like is putting a little bit of float in front of each major milestone. In other words, take your milestone is at its earliest possible date, make it a few days or a week later. Constrain it a few days or a week later, which will put some float in front of each of those milestones, and it'll extend your whole schedule by the amount that you want it to build in your contingency reserves. There's no perfect answer to this. My advice is to be conscious about how you are handling risk within your schedule. There's a couple of risk analysis techniques. One is program evaluation and review technique. I always give PERT credit for coming up with schedule risk analysis, although frankly nobody uses it these days. But it first introduced us to the idea of probabilistic scheduling. More commonly, when dealing with schedule risk analysis, we use Monte Carlo simulation tacked onto our project management software. But these would be suitable topics for separate video clips.